So for a third and final part of Autodesk 3ds Max Design 2011 Design Visualization Workflow for Civil, we'll have a look on how we can apply a camera outside of the corridor and create some more interesting animation. We'll add some trees in our surrounding using the object paint, and we'll render a final animation using Mental Ray. Okay, so far we've seen how we're able to animate a camera along this corridor feature line that we import in our model. Although these camera animations are really good for validation and experiencing those corridors, they might be a little bit boring to sell the project because they're just kind of stuck to the feature line that we're importing. So perhaps placing a camera that is a little bit free, that you can manipulate yourself and really pick and choose the angle that you want might be a little bit more interesting to sell the product and really drive attention to the places where you want attention to be placed on your specific data set. So for example, if we have a look at the series of camera animation that I have here, I'm really picking and choosing where I want this camera to look at, what the movement of these camera are, and also how fluid I want this camera to be. So this is really the strength of 3ds Max Design. It's kind of a cinematography tools that allows you to place camera and animate them everywhere and anywhere you want them. So really use your imagination and creativity to drive attention to your project exactly where you want the attention to be. So we're going to have a look on how we can create camera animation outside of those corridor feature lines. Okay, so we're going to start by going to top view and wireframe. So to create a camera, you're going to go to 3ds Max Design control panel under the camera tab. And you have a choice here of creating a target camera or a free camera. Personally, I prefer the target camera when it's time to animate because I have two objects, the camera itself and the target, which is the aim, which is what exactly the camera is looking at. So I've just created a camera on my top view and I'm going to position it on top of my corridor. When moving the camera, if you only select the camera, obviously you're only moving the camera. If you want to move both objects, you can select the middle and it's going to select both of these objects. So I'm going to go and place it in the middle of my corridor. Now I don't know what this camera is seeing, so in order to create camera animation, I find it sometimes easier to go to a 4-pane view and align your camera to what you're going to see. So one of the view, it's going to be my camera view, so you see my camera is here. One of the views is going to be a top view, and one of my view is going to be a front view. Now in my camera view, I want to make sure that the save frame is turned on by pressing Shift F. So save frame is the aspect ratio of the camera, therefore what the camera is going to see and render. So right now there's a problem. I'm kind of underneath my terrain. This is because I haven't changed the angle of my camera. So in the front view, I'm going to select my camera and move it above my terrain. So now I can see what my camera is seeing. So I can kind of just readjust a little bit my camera and kind of pick and choose where my first frame of this animation is going to be. So let's say something like this. So this is my animation cursor. So the minute I turn the auto key on, it's going to start recording every action that I'm doing. So be careful once the auto key is turned on to make sure that you're not recording an action that you don't want a keyframe on. The first keyframe, I'm going to hit the set key to make sure that I have a keyframe at frame 0. Then, how long do I want my animation to be? For this particular example, I'm going to make my animation 12 seconds long. So 30 frames per second. So 360 frames later. So I'm going to move to frame 360. And now I get to pick what is my last frame of this animation. So I'm going to move my camera forward on my corridor and perhaps realign the corridor view so it's a little bit more central. So you see that it saved a frame automatically. Keep in mind that it's saving a frame for both the camera and the target. So if I select each of these objects individually, you see there is keyframe for the target and also keyframe for the camera. So I can animate both of these objects separately. So I'm going to turn the auto key off. I'm going to go to my camera view and hit play. So for now, I have a simple camera animation that goes along my corridor. So that is kind of like simple animation. You can do pan, you can do move across. Those little simple animation can come really handy when it's time to focus on one specific part of the corridor. Now to add a little bit more interest to this camera, I'm going to add a roll to the camera. So I'm going to go back to frame 0. So I'm going to select my camera only because I don't want to add a roll to the camera and the target. I only want to adjust the camera at this point. I'm going to go to my camera view, turn on the auto key because I want to start recording my action again, choose the roll camera, and start adding roll to this camera. So, you know, when you're in a helicopter ride, you're always kind of moving a little bit and you're always in a certain angle compared to the world. Then I'm going to move to my last frame of my animation and add a roll on the opposite side of this camera. I'm going to press the auto key again and I'm going to hit play again and see the result of this animation. Now I've added a roll to the camera, so already this camera animation starts to be a little bit more interested, a little bit more realistic. Now if I would be in a helicopter, there's no way the camera would be so still. It would be a little bit of movement in this camera, some sort of a noise. So this is also possible in 3ds Max Design by adding layer on top of this animation. So let's go back to a one pane view and open the animation layer. So I'm going to right click to the toolbox and call the animation layers. I'm going to enable the animation layer and just select all of the modifier available just to make sure that I have possibility to animate all of these layers. So basically what happened here, the first animation I did went on a base layer. Now I want to add a layer on top of this so I can kind of animate both without affecting the first animation I did. So I'm going to add a layer and I'm going to call this one Helicam. So now you see I have two layers. I can always go back to the base layer where you see my keyframe have been added, or I could stay on the Helicam layer. So I'm kind of adding animation on top of the other. On the Helicam layer, I'm going to go to the motion tab. So when you think animation, you're thinking motion tab. In the motion tab, under the position controller, you see that I have both of my layers here. I have the base layer and the Helicam layer. So I'm going to go under the Helicam layer and I'm going to add a noise on the Y position. So with the Y position selected, I'm going to assign a controller, and there's a bunch of different controllers here that you can add to your animation. For this particular example, I'm going to add a noise float controller. Here it's giving you a preview of this noise controller that's been added on top of your original animation. Now, if I play this animation again the way it is, you'll see that a really heavy noise has been added to this camera. Now it's really denty because it's a fractal noise. I'm going to uncheck the fractal noise to have something a little bit more smooth. I'm going to lower the frequency but increase the strength just so we see the result of this noise on top of our camera. So if I move the cursor animation, you see that there's noise now that it's been added to my corridor. So you see there's a little bit of movement. Obviously this is a bit too strong for what I want. So I'm going to lower the strength back to 5 and maybe lower the frequency to 0.15. It's really subtle, but it's definitely adding realism to your scene. I can dock this layer animation if I don't want it to be in the way. Now I have previously rendered this camera and you can see here the subtle movements of the noise in the camera. So obviously this one is a little bit too strong. The second example gives you a more refined version of this camera animation, so you can see that the camera is navigating through this corridor with a really slight noise movement, reproducing the movement of an helicopter ride. Okay, so this is the render of where we're at the moment, looking at the main corridor, Pemberton Road. What we want to do is add some more realism by adding foliage and a little bit more detail and realism to our shots. So we'll have a look on how we can add the foliage using the Paint Object tool. Before we start adding trees, to ease the management of our scene, we're going to place all of these trees on a separate layer, so it will be easy for us to hide them if we don't want to render them to do a quicker render. So let's add a layer here and name this layer trees. So the check mark indicates that you're now sitting on this layer. So everything that is going to be created will now be created on the layer trees. So let's choose the Pemberton Road center line, which sits in the middle here, and we're going to use this center line as a parent shape for our object placement style. Then I'm just going to load a style that I've created previously that is composed of 3 different trees that are going to be applied along the quarter center line. So you see my 3 different trees here. Although placing trees using the object style editor is a great method, it doesn't allow you a lot of randomness or free-form placement because these trees are attached and have the same offset from the center line. So let's have a look on how else we can place trees using the new object paint. Let's maximize the graphite modeling tools where you'll see the Object Paint tab. I'm choosing to use the Dynamite VSP contents because Dynamite VSP offer a large library of different objects that you can be placing around your dataset. You can decide to place any other objects that are coming from Max and even place Mental Ray Proxy. In order to be able to place these trees, I'm going to have to break the link that these trees have to the parent feature line. So let's select the first tree, go to the Dynamite VSP control panel under the Tracking tab, and remove the parent shape. Therefore, the tree is now freestanding and I can move and position this tree wherever I want in my dataset. So I'm going to do the same for the 2 other trees and break the link to the parent shape. So I now have 3 different trees that I can move and position wherever I want. So using the Object Paint, I'm going to pick these 3 different trees. So now I have 3 objects in my object list and I will be painting these objects on my terrain. I'm going to choose to paint these 3 objects randomly. And I'm going to choose to paint on a selected object and select my terrain. We'll turn on the edge faces to make sure that the terrain is the object that I have selected and pick a different angle where I can see what I'm going to paint. So obviously, following my bitmap, the area that are green are most likely going to be the area where I need to plant some trees. I'm going to give a spacing of 10, so there's enough space in between these trees. And I'm going to start painting on this selected object. So you see that wherever my cursor is going, it is planting trees, and these trees are following my terrain curvature. Once you start placing few trees, you can start adjusting some of the preset of your paintbrush by adding some UVW displacements and adding a little bit more randomness. You can choose to rotate these trees and even scale them randomly. You can move to a different location of your terrain and continue on painting with the preset of your brush that you've been adjusting. It is really easy to create some small cluster of trees while using the object paints and playing with the UVW offset. You can even save your brush setting and reload them for future painting in this scene or any other scene. Once you're happy with the painting action, you can just commit to the painting that you have done, locking the painting action. You now see that this scene is starting to have a bit more realism. Now that our data set is fully developed, including foliage, moving trees, a lot more detail, and different camera animation that are focusing on different parts of this dataset, we are ready to render an animation. So far, we have looked at the preset needed to render a still image. To render a still image, we don't need to worry too much about the final gather pass since every object are still, therefore render the image as is. But when rendering an animation, we have to take 2 things in consideration. We are dealing with a moving camera, and for this particular example, we're also dealing with moving objects. When the final gather points are not locked on the geometry, they slide along the surface as the camera moves, introducing rendering glitches that looks like dark moving splotches. To handle moving objects, 1 final gather map file per frame is processed in a first pass. When the beauty pass is rendered, final gather points are interpolated across multiple frames to smooth out the solution. This is what we refer as the frame interpolation for final gather maps. So when it is time to render your animation, you will need to change some of the rendering presets. First, you might want to increase the anti-aliasing of your image to smooth out the edge of your objects and avoid flickering of thin surfaces such as lampposts for this example. In the Render Setup window, under the Common tab will change the single image to either an active segment or a range of frame. You want to make sure to save your render output to your preference of image sequences or direct AVI or QuickTime output. Then, under the Indirect Illumination tab, Reuse section will change the mode to 1 file per frame, which is the preset that is best for moving objects. We'll then change the Final Gather Map preset to incrementally add FG point to map files. Save the Final Gather Map, and check the Skip Final Rendering option box to generate the Final Gather Map file now. What we're doing now is calculating the Final Gather Map file first. This way, we'll be able to lock and interpolate across multiple frames for the final rendering pass. It will then calculate one Final Gather Map for each of your images included in your animation. For this example, 800 images, therefore 800 Final Gather Map file. So you see that it's skipping the final rendering, only generating the Final Gather Map files. So we'll stop it for now. Looking at the Render Asset folder, I can see the Final Gather Map file that have been calculated for each frames. Next, we'll uncheck the Skip Final Rendering box, change the Final Gather preset to read FG point only from existing map file, and render the final animation. By doing this process, we are locking the Final Gather Map, only reading what it's been calculating. The rendering will start skipping the Final Gather pass because it is already calculated and it is now interpolating the 2 frame before and the 2 frame after to give you a smooth result without any glitches. So let's have a look at the end result here of all our camera animation. We had a look on how to add realism to a camera by adding a little bit of noise to recreate the helicopter move here. We also created multiple different cameras outside of the camera that are animated along those corridor feature lines. But we are able, in the final output of all of these cameras, to match both the camera animated along the corridor with the freestanding camera that we animated outside of the corridor to drive attention and interest into our data set and to really experience this new corridor and the change that we've been doing to our data set and to the corridor feature line, including the existing road and driving attention to what is already existing in comparison to the new upgrades that we are doing to this data set. Using the Autodesk Civil Visualization extension allowed to generate civil engineering projects extremely fast without having to become an expert in 3ds Max design, also allowing to incorporate the design changes in our visualization, which is critical to design validation. The Civil Visualization extension allows a strong integration of civil 3D data in 3ds Max design. With a style-driven approach and a parametric object library, you don't need to be an expert to generate high-quality visualization. And this will conclude our workflow for civil engineering with 3ds Max Design 2011 using the Civil Visualization extension.